There is a thing about a woman named Isadora Linwood that most people in Issaquah, Washington never bothered to learn. They saw the rusted Subaru in the driveway. They saw the peeling paint on the eaves and the quarter-acre of Himalayan blackberries swallowing the back fence. They saw a woman in her late 60s who carried groceries in a canvas bag that was starting to fray at the handles, and they assumed they understood everything worth understanding about her situation. They were wrong about almost all of it, but we will get to that. First, there is a tool you need to know about. It is a hand-trowel steel blade oak handle worn smooth from decades of use. The kind of tool that does not look like much until you understand what it has done. It belonged to Isadora's grandmother, Mehetabel Linwood. And on the morning this story begins, it was sitting on the kitchen floor of Mehetabel's old house, next to a pink envelope from the King County Superior Court, and a cell phone showing a Chase Bank balance of $12.43. If you have ever sat in a cold room and looked at a number on a screen and felt the floor shift under you, you already know what Isadora was feeling in that moment. If you have ever given everything you had to something and then watched someone take credit for it and push you out the door, you know even more. This story is for you. And I need you to remember that trowel. Because by the time we reach the end of what happened in that backyard in Issaquah, you will understand why it mattered more than anything Birch Calloway ever built. Isadora Adeline Linwood was 68 years old. She had spent the previous 10 years as a senior botanist at Wright Agrotech, a mid-sized agricultural technology company headquartered in downtown Seattle. Before that, she had spent 3 years earning a doctorate in plant biology at the University of Washington. Before that, she had spent her entire childhood on this same piece of land, kneeling in the dirt beside her grandmother, Mehetabel, learning how to read soil the way other children learn to read books. She did not choose plant science because of a lab. She chose it because of the earth under her fingernails and the way Mehetabel could hold a handful of clay and tell you within a season what it would and would not grow. Isadora had always belonged to the ground, not to the fluorescent lights of a research building. Her 10 years at Wright Agrotech were 10 years of slow drift away from the thing that made her who she was. She did not realize how far she had drifted until the morning they escorted her out of the building with a cardboard box and a document she refused to sign. The system she had developed was called the mycorrhizal loop. 3 years of her life went into it. The core idea was elegant in the way that the best ideas always are a cultivated network of mycorrhizal fungi woven through growing medium at a microscopic level, creating a biological communication and nutrient transfer system between plant roots and soil. The result was a crop that could draw what it needed directly from the earth around it, reducing dependence on synthetic fertilizers by 60%. In a world facing soil degradation on a continental scale, that number was not just impressive. It was in the right hands worth a great deal of money. Birch Calloway had understood that immediately. What Isadora had not understood, not until it was too late, was that Birch Calloway considered the mycorrhizal loop to be worth far more buried than active. Wright Agrotech held regional distribution contracts with OmniGrow, one of the largest synthetic fertilizer suppliers in the Pacific Northwest. A technology that cut fertilizer dependence by 60% was not a revolution to Birch Calloway. It was a threat to a revenue stream that kept his quarterly numbers stable and his board of directors quiet. So he buried the patent, quietly, cleanly, the way Birch Calloway did most things. Isadora had not gone quietly. That was the problem. She had taken her research directly to the board of directors without Birch's approval, walking into a quarterly strategy meeting with a 40-slide presentation and 3 years of field data. The board had listened. They had even asked questions. And then Birch had smiled his particular smile, the one that did not touch his eyes, and thanked her for her passion and adjourned the meeting and called her into his office the following morning with his attorney already in the room. The attorney's name was Odessa Whitfield. She was 38 years old, and she sat in the corner chair with a leather portfolio on her knees and said nothing at all during the entire meeting. She did not need to. The document in front of Isadora said everything Odessa Whitfield needed to communicate. Birch was precise that morning. He did not raise his voice. He did not use words that could be recorded and used against him later. He said that Isadora had demonstrated a troubling pattern of insubordination. He said the board had concerns about her professional judgment. He said Wright Agrotech valued her contributions, but felt it was time to part ways. He slid the non-disclosure agreement across the desk. Isadora looked at this document. Signing it meant surrendering any claim to the mycorrhizal loop. It meant accepting a severance package in exchange for silence. It meant that 10 years of her work, and within that, The 3 most important years of her life would be absorbed into the machinery of a company she no longer trusted, used or buried according to whatever Birch Calloway decided was most profitable. She thought about her mother. Margaret Linwood had been in Providence Regional Medical Center for 14 months before she died. 14 months of treatments that insurance covered partially, and then stopped covering, and then did not cover at all. Isadora had written checks until there were no more checks to write. $60,000. Her entire savings. She had done it without hesitation because Margaret was her mother, and there was no other possible response to that fact. But the money was gone, and with it the cushion that might have allowed her to fight. She thought about the house, Mehetabel's house, the only thing left of a family she had spent her whole life belonging to, now sitting under a foreclosure notice because Isadora had fallen behind on the property taxes and the mortgage during the months she had been paying hospital bills. She thought about all of that, and then she looked at Odessa Whitfield sitting perfectly still in the corner, and she said quietly, "I will not sign this." Birch put the cap back on his pen. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel intentional. Then he said, "I contacted Pacific Seed Alliance Omnigro and Monsanto Pacific Northwest before this meeting. All 3 received the same summary regarding your conduct. You are free to leave at any time, Isadora." That sentence landed in the room like something dropped from a height. He had made the calls before the meeting, before she had even refused. He had known she would refuse, and he had already closed every door behind her. Odessa Whitfield collected the unsigned document from the desk. She did not look at Isadora. She straightened the pages, slid them back into the portfolio, and clicked it shut. That was all. The meeting was over. The walk to her car took 4 minutes. Isadora counted the steps without meaning to, the way the mind reaches for something to hold when everything else is moving too fast to grasp. The cardboard box in her arms held a coffee mug, 2 framed photographs, and Mehetabel's trowel, which Isadora had kept in her desk drawer for a decade, a habit she had never examined too closely until this moment. She sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes before she could make herself start the engine. The 2 weeks that followed were not dramatic in any cinematic sense. There were no confrontations, no doors slamming, no scenes of any kind. There was just the slow, grinding accumulation of closed doors. Isadora submitted applications to every nursery, farm cooperative research institution, and agricultural startup within 100 miles of Seattle. The responses were swift. Most of them were brief. A few did not come at all. On a Tuesday in the 3rd week, she drove to Cascadia Nursery in Issaquah, a small independent operation she had collaborated with informally during her years at Wright Agritech. The owner, Emmett Solbeck, was a decent man who had always spoken respectfully to her and whose handshake she had trusted. He took her application, read it carefully, and then stepped away to make a phone call. When he came back, his face had changed in the way faces change when someone has just been told something they did not want to hear. He said, "I am sorry, Isadora. I have been hearing things I cannot ignore. I cannot risk the reputation of this nursery." She nodded. She did not ask what things. She already knew. She said thank you, which surprised him, and she left. That evening, she sat on the back porch of Mehetabel's house and looked out at the yard. A 1/4 acre of Himalayan blackberries, heavy clay soil the color of old iron, and the rusted frame of a water heater a previous tenant had abandoned against the back fence. The gas had been shut off 2 days before. The kitchen was cold. The pantry held a bag of rice that was 3/4 empty and a jar of peanut butter with maybe 6 servings left. She had Mehetabel's trowel in her lap. She was turning it over in her hands without thinking about it, the way you handle something familiar when your mind is somewhere else. She opened the old toolbox that had sat under the potting bench since Mehetabel's time and found it exactly as her grandmother had left it. The trowel, a pair of pruning shears, a soil pH meter that still worked on the original battery, and at the bottom folded twice a piece of lined paper in Mehetabel's handwriting. The words on it were simple: "The soil beneath your feet will never betray you." Mehetabel had written it in 1987, the year she won a small but significant fight with the county over this particular piece of ground. Isadora did not know the details of that fight. She had been a child. She only knew that Mehetabel had kept the house, kept the land, and kept this note, and that those 3 things were connected in a way Isadora had never thought to question. She folded the note carefully and put it back where she found it. She did not read it again that night. She did not need to. What she needed was a plan, and what she had was $12.43 and 61 days before the bank moved on the house. The following morning, Isadora's neighbor appeared in her backyard without knocking or calling first. which was not entirely surprising given that Sheridan Driscoll had been operating according to his own internal logic for the past 7 decades and showed no signs of reconsidering that approach. He was 71 years old, thick through the shoulders, in the way men who have worked with their hands their whole lives tend to be, with a gray beard that he trimmed irregularly and eyes the color of the Pacific in November. He had farmed apple orchards in Yakima Valley for 30 years before moving to Issaquah after his wife passed, and he carried the particular quiet authority of a man who had learned most of what mattered about the world by watching it rather than talking at it. He had a soil pH meter in his hand, one that looked considerably more sophisticated than Mehetabel's old one. He crouched down in the center of the backyard, pushed the probe into the earth, and waited. Then he stood up, read the display, and said 6.2. Clay is too heavy, no drainage to speak of. I have been looking at this plot for 2 years. Whatever you are planning to do with it, I would save myself the trouble. Isadora looked at him. She said, you climbed through someone else's fence to tell them not to bother trying. Sheridan looked at her for a moment. Then he climbed back over the fence without another word. But at the top of it, he paused, one leg on each side, and said, unless you know how to do something I have never seen done, which I would consider unlikely, that is my professional assessment. Then he was gone. Isadora stood in the ruined yard and looked at the blackberries and the clay and the rusted water heater, and she thought about that word. Unlikely. She had heard it before in different rooms from different mouths. She had learned that unlikely was usually the opinion of people who had already decided to stop looking. She went inside and put on her only clean blouse and her wool coat, and she drove to a gray market seed and antique swap meet held in a warehouse down by the Seattle waterfront. She had heard about it from a graduate student years ago, some underground gathering of urban homesteaders and eccentric botanists operating well outside the polished corridors of institutions like Wright Agritech. She was not going for seeds. She was going to sell Mehetabel's silver locket, the last valuable thing she owned, because sentimentality was a luxury that required at least $15 in the bank. The warehouse smelled of ozone and damp canvas, and something green and biological underneath both of those, like the smell of a forest floor after rain. Tables ran the length of the space in both directions, piled with corked glass jars, dried root bundles, heirloom seed packets sealed with wax soil testing kits, hand tools with handles worn down to the wood. People moved through the aisles slowly and seriously, the way people move when they are looking for something specific and have learned not to hurry. Isadora moved through 3 rows of antique vendors without finding anyone willing to offer more than scrap silverweight for the locket. She was turning back toward the exit when her foot caught the edge of a wooden crate that was protruding into the aisle, and she stumbled forward and caught herself on the edge of the table in front of her. A voice said, "Watch where you step. That is a dormant mandrake root, and its disposition is worse than mine." She looked up. The man behind the table was somewhere in his mid-70s, with white hair that stood in several directions at once, and wire-rimmed glasses that had been repaired at one hinge with what appeared to be a twist of copper wire. He wore a heavy canvas apron stained with iodine and what looked like activated charcoal, and his hands rested on the table surface with the particular steadiness of someone who is accustomed to handling things that require care. The table in front of him held a collection of glass vials, dried herb bundles, and a dozen or more gnarled root specimens arranged on a piece of black velvet. His name was written on a piece of cardboard taped to the table's edge in black marker, Absalom Beaumont. Rare botanicals. She said, "I'm sorry, I was not watching." He was not looking at her face. He was looking at her hands. He said, "Callus formation on the palmar metacarpals. Soil discoloration in the cuticle beds. Pallor consistent with long hours under artificial light rather than sun. You are not a hobbyist. Commercial hydroponics or controlled environment agriculture most likely. Senior level given your age and the specific distribution of where." She took a step back. She said, "I was a botanist. Currently, I am unemployed." He said, "Name." She said, "Isadora Linwood." Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, not the way things shift in films, but in the small and specific way of a man who has just placed a thing he has been turning over in his mind for a long time. He opened one of the drawers beneath the table surface and lifted out a piece of paper, a photocopy folded in thirds. He unfolded it and placed it on the table between them. It was a printed copy of a peer-reviewed paper. The title read, "Mycorrhizal Network Optimization in High-Density Urban Environments." The author line read, "Aya Linwood." The publication date was 3 years prior. She said, "How do you have that?" He said, "Because I have been following the burial of this paper since the month it disappeared. I was the director of the Seed Preservation Institute at the University of Washington before OmniGrow defunded us in 2015. 12 years of work gone in a budget cycle. The man who lobbied most effectively for that outcome was a mid-level OmniGrow vice president at the time. His name was Birch Calloway." The warehouse noise continued around them, the low murmur of transactions and examination. Isadora stood still. She said, "He did the same thing to you." Absalom said, a different version of the same machinery. "Yes, I was older when it happened. I had less to lose in the conventional sense, and more to lose in the one that matters. I lost the work. That is the thing you do not recover from in the way people imagine you recover from things." He reached beneath the table and brought up a small iron box, the kind that might once have held cash or documents. He unlocked it with a brass key that hung around his neck on a cord. Inside, resting in a square of dark velvet, was a single glass vial sealed with red wax. The contents were visible through the glass, one seed roughly the size of a walnut surface texture, irregular and dark, the color of obsidian. He said, "The Aurelia Black. I have been holding this for 11 years. I acquired the original genetic material from a defunct Soviet seed bank archive in Svalbard, a preservation deposit that no institution wanted to fund once the Cold War ended. I cross-pollinated it over 7 years with a hyper-resilient Andean nightshade variety that evolved in high-sulfur volcanic soil. What I produced is a fruiting plant with an extreme growth rate, unusual soil toxin tolerance, and a flavor profile that has no commercial equivalent. The fruit itself, when mature, carries a combination of deep umami smoked honey and a citrus acidity that builds rather than fades. Chefs who have tasted the early specimens have described it in terms I am not accustomed to hearing applied to produce." Isadora looked at the vial. She said, "Why have you not grown it yourself?" He tapped his chest twice, a gesture that communicated what he did not choose to say directly. He said, "It requires someone who understands soil biology at the molecular level to coax it properly. It will not cooperate with a hobbyist or with someone following instructions. It needs to be understood, not managed. I have been waiting for the right person. In 11 years, no one who came through this building had sufficient reason to not give up when it inevitably became difficult." He held the vial out to her. She looked at it for a moment. Outside the warehouse windows, the sky was the particular shade of gray. Seattle does in November, deep and close and absolute. She had $12 in her account. She had 61 days. She had a grandmother's house that she could not afford to keep, and a yard that a 71-year-old apple farmer had told her was not worth trying. She thought about Birch Calloway in his tailored suit making calls before the meeting. She thought about Odessa Whitfield clicking the portfolio shut without looking at her. She thought about Emmett Solbeck's face when he came back from the phone. She thought about Mehetabel's note folded at the bottom of a toolbox. She said, "I cannot pay you for this." He said, "I do not want your money. I want 20% of your first commercial harvest. If the plant dies, we never speak again. If it lives, I will have my revenge against the people who told me what I built was worthless, and you will have yours." Isadora reached out and took the vial from his hand. She said, "Deal." She drove back to Issaquah in the dark. She parked in the cracked driveway and sat in the car for a moment, the vial in her palm, the red wax seal catching the glow from the neighbor's porch light. From across the fence came the low sound of a television. She could see through the side window that Sheridan Driscoll's kitchen light was on. She got out of the car. She walked around to the backyard. The blackberries were invisible in the dark, but she could feel their presence, the way you feel the presence of something large and patient. She found the spot she had been looking at since she arrived back at the house, the lowest point of the yard, where the soil had the most drainage potential, far from the old water heater in the fence. She picked up Mehetabel's trowel from where she had left it on the potting bench. She pressed the blade into the earth. The ground was hard. The trowel skidded and lifted. She set her weight behind it and pressed again, and this time it went in an inch, and then 2. And she felt the resistance of 40 years of compacted clay pushing back against her, and she kept going anyway. From somewhere on the other side of the fence, without a window opening or a voice being raised, she had the sense of being observed. She did not stop digging. She thought about what Absalom had said as she was leaving the warehouse. He had said, "I have been waiting for someone with a reason strong enough." In 11 years, no one had that reason. She had asked him what changed his mind about her, and he had said something she had turned over the entire drive home without fully landing on. He had said, "I am not sure anything changed my mind. I think you walked in here already carrying it." The trowel went deeper. The clay was cold and heavy, and it smelled like everything old and resistant and full of the quiet kind of potential that most people mistake for nothing at all. Isadora Linwood kept digging. On the 8th morning, Isadora walked out the back door in her socks and stopped 3 feet from the edge of the cleared plot and did not move for a long time. The sprout that had pushed through the clay overnight was not green. It was a deep, iridescent purple, the color of a bruise at the moment it first surfaces, with 2 thick, fleshy leaves already unfurled, and a stem that looked less like something fragile and new, and more like something that had been waiting underground with considerable patience and had simply decided the time had come. She crouched down until she was eye level with it. The leaves had a waxy density she had not expected at this stage. She pressed one fingertip very lightly against the surface and felt resistance, the kind of cellular firmness that takes weeks to develop in ordinary specimens. It was not an ordinary specimen. She went inside and called Absalom. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been awake for a while. She said it came up purple. He said, "I know. That is the Andean lineage expressing. The chlorophyll production is suppressed in the early growth stage because the plant is prioritizing root mass and fungal network establishment. When it shifts to fruiting, the color will change." "How does the stem look?" She said, "Thick, denser than it should be at this stage." He said, "Good. Do not touch it again. Let it find the soil. That plant knows what it is doing better than either of us does right now." She went back outside and stood at the edge of the plot and watched the sprout in the gray morning light, which was the closest thing to doing something useful that she could manage. The days that followed moved at 2 speeds simultaneously. Inside the house, time dragged in the particular way it drags when money is nearly gone, and every morning begins with a mental accounting of what remains. She was down to the last third of the rice. She had found $4 in quarters in the pocket of a winter coat she had not worn since her mother was still alive. She made the peanut butter last by eating less of it each day, which is the kind of calculation you do not share with people because there is nothing anyone can say to it that makes it better. Outside in the backyard, time moved at a speed that did not seem possible. By the end of the second week, the plant had reached 4 feet. The stem had thickened to the diameter of a broom handle, and the vines had begun to extend laterally, reaching toward the fence posts with a deliberate, almost architectural intelligence. The leaves had deepened in color to something closer to the purple of old stained glass, and when the afternoon light came through the gaps in the cloud cover and hit them directly, they seemed to pulse with a quality that Isadora, who had spent years thinking precisely about plants, and what they did could only describe as intent. She was in the yard measuring the new growth one morning when she heard the familiar sound of boots on the wooden fence rail. Sheridan Driscoll landed on her side with more ease than a 71-year-old man had any right to manage, straightened up, and looked at the plant for a long moment without saying anything. Then he walked toward it at a deliberate pace, stopped 2 feet away, and looked at it the way he had looked at the soil pH reading the first time he came carefully, without any particular conclusion already made. She said, "You are in my yard again." He said, "I can see that." He looked at the plant for another moment. He said, "This is not what I expected." She said, "You expected nothing to happen." He said, "I expected nothing worth paying attention to. This is something worth paying attention to." He turned and looked at her. "What is it?" She said, "A fruiting plant, heirloom stock from a serious breeder." He said, "I have been growing things for 40 years, and I have never seen a growth rate like this in clay soil without heavy amendment." She said, "The root system is doing something to the soil chemistry as it establishes. The clay is not the obstacle we thought it was." He looked at the plant again, then at her, and then he climbed back over the fence without another word. But 2 hours later, when she came back outside, there were 4 wooden stakes leaning against the fence on her side, cut to uniform length, sanded smooth at the tips. No note, no knock at the door, just the stakes standing where the fence met the ground waiting. She used them as trellising supports before the end of the day. By the 4th week, the Aurelia Black was 6 feet tall and blooming. The flowers came in first as tight velvet buds the color of deep space, and then opened over the course of 48 hours into full black blooms with a fragrance that Isadora had not expected, and could not entirely account for vanilla at the core, with something underneath it that was closer to wood smoke, or maybe the smell of an old library, something warm and complex that had no obvious biological precedent. She started keeping the back windows closed during the day because the smell drifted through the house and she did not want questions from the street. It was the smell that she thought about later when she tried to understand how things had unraveled the way they did. Because the smell carried, and Issaquah is not a large town, and some things travel faster than you intend them to. The fruit appeared in the 6th week. Clusters of them, distributed across the vine with a structural regularity that spoke to the unusual intelligence of the plant's architecture. At maturity, they were roughly the size of large heirloom tomatoes. Their skin a dark crimson shot through with veins of actual gold coloring. Not yellow, not amber, but a warm metallic tone that caught light with an almost mineral quality. The skin was firm but yielded with the right pressure. And when Isadora finally cut the first one open at her kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, the flesh inside was a deep ruby red, and the juice ran across the cutting board like something fermented and old and very alive. She ate a single slice standing at the counter. She had spent a career tasting and analyzing produce. She had an educated palate and a scientist's habit of breaking flavor into components. She did those things automatically and then stopped doing them because the Aurelia Black did not cooperate with that kind of analysis. The flavors did not present themselves in sequence the way flavors in ordinary fruit do. They arrived together, the deep savory weight of the umami, the sweetness of smoked honey, a citrus acidity that sharpened rather than faded over the next 30 seconds as she stood there at the counter, not moving. She set down the knife. She looked at what remained of the fruit on the cutting board. She thought about Absalom in the warehouse saying chefs have used terms I am not accustomed to hearing applied to produce. She understood that now. She packed 6 fruits in a dented container, put on her cleanest clothes, and drove to Seattle. She did not go to a farmer's market. She did not approach a grocery distributor or a food co-op or any of the intermediary channels that would have taken weeks and required references she no longer had. She drove directly to Lumiere, a restaurant on First Hill that held 2 Michelin stars and whose head chef, Walcott Bancroft, had a public reputation for pursuing unusual local ingredients with the kind of single-minded determination most people reserve for things considerably more significant than vegetables. She found the kitchen loading dock on the alley side and waited. She waited for 2 hours and 11 minutes in a light Seattle drizzle that was technically not raining, but was also not raining the way Seattle weather operates for approximately 9 months of the year. She had a folded copy of the Tribune to keep her hands busy. She did not use it. She stood and waited, which is a skill that most people have to learn the hard way, and Isadora had learned it thoroughly. Walcott Bancroft came out the back door at 8:15 for a cigarette. He was 52 years old and built like someone who had spent decades in commercial kitchens, which is to say dense through the forearms, efficient in his movements, and possessed of a stillness that could tip into impatience without visible warning. His chef's coat had 2 burn marks on the left sleeve that he had not bothered to address. His hands were scarred in the specific patterned way that comes from years of professional knife work. He saw Isadora standing by the dock, and his expression indicated clearly that he was not interested in what she was selling. She said, "Chef Bancroft, give me 30 seconds. If you are not interested in what I have, I will leave and you will never see me again." He said, "We do not source from unvetted suppliers." She popped the lid off the container. The smell hit the alley with enough presence that Walcott Bancroft stopped moving. He looked at the container, then at her, then at the container again. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small folding knife, opened it and cut a thin slice from one of the fruits. He held it up in the light from the dock. He placed it on his tongue. 10 seconds passed. Isadora counted them. Bancroft said, "Where did you get this?" She said, "I grew it in Issaquah, my backyard." He looked at her the way people look at something that does not fit the available categories. He said, "I have never tasted anything structured like this. The umami base layer is doing something I cannot account for botanically. It is like..." He stopped. Started again. "It is extraordinary. How much do you have?" She said, "About 40 pounds available now. The plant is still fruiting." She had 20 pounds. She had learned from a decade in corporate settings that the first number you say is the number the negotiation begins from, not the number it ends at. He said, "I want all of it. $50 a pound cash advance, and I want an exclusivity arrangement. No one else in this city gets this fruit until I say otherwise." Her heart was doing something irregular behind her ribs. $2,000. Against a foreclosure notice and an empty pantry, $2,000 was not a solution, but it was the difference between 61 days and 91 days, and 91 days was enough time to think. She said, "Agreed." He said, "I need the name of the grower for my supplier records." She said, "Isadora Linwood, Issaquah." He wrote it down. She drove home with a cashier's check in her coat pocket and the particular sensation in her chest of a person who has just bought themselves a small amount of time, which is a different feeling than hope, but is sometimes, if you are careful with it, the thing that leads there. She did not know that Walcott Bancroft had a standing reservation on his books for Table 7 every Wednesday evening. She did not know who held that reservation. She would not find out until the following morning when Bancroft called her on her cell phone at 7:45 and spoke in a tone that was careful in the way a man is careful when he is trying not to alarm someone while delivering alarming information. He said, "Ms. Linwood, I want to tell you something about last night before you hear it from someone else. I had a guest at Table 7 who asked a significant number of questions about the new ingredient in the amuse-bouche I served. I did not tell him anything. My sommelier, however, has a gambling situation I was apparently not fully aware of. He told this guest your name and your town for what I understand to be $300 in cash." She said, "Who was the guest?" Bancroft said, "Birch Calloway." The kitchen went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when the temperature drops suddenly and completely. She said, "Thank you for telling me." She ended the call and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard. The Aurelia Black filled the rear half of the plot, now its vines draped over the trellis stakes. Sheridan had cut its leaves, moving slightly in the morning air, with that quality of intention she had noticed from the beginning. It was by any measure the most remarkable thing she had ever grown. She called Absalom. He picked up on the first ring this time. She said, "Birch Calloway ate at Lumiere last night. He had the fruit. He knows where I live." Absalom was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said he will not go to court first. A lawsuit takes time, and time allows you to establish market dominance and patent the genetics. He will move faster than that. He will try to destroy the plant before you can formalize anything. She said, "Destroy it how?" He said, "Wright Agrotech holds the regional distribution license for a commercial-grade industrial defoliant called Toxaway. It is designed for heavy brush clearing. Contact with the root zone is fatal to virtually any biological specimen within 72 hours. He will send someone at night, probably within the week." She said, "How do I stop that?" He said, "You probably cannot stop him from sending someone, but you can protect the plant. Write down what I tell you." She wrote it down. The following morning, Isadora withdrew the full $2,000 from her account, which left it at $11 in change, and drove to a hardware store in Renton where she was unlikely to be recognized. She bought 3 Wise security cameras, a roll of heavy-gauge wire for mounting 2 50-pound bags of activated agricultural charcoal, and 40 feet of heavy canvas tarpaulin. She also bought a pulley system designed for hanging game, because Absalom had been specific about the need for speed when deploying the tarp, and manual deployment over a 6-foot plant in the dark was not practical. She spent that afternoon and the following morning installing the cameras at 3 points along the fence perimeter, angled to cover the full rear yard and both gate approaches. She ran the charcoal in a deep trench around the root zone of the Aurelia Black, packing it tight and then covering it with the existing topsoil so that the barrier was not visible from above. The tarp she rigged on the pulley system with the release point tied to a cleat on the back porch, so that one pull of the rope would drop it over the canopy in under 4 seconds. Sheridan watched all of this from his side of the fence over the course of 2 days. He did not ask questions. He did not offer commentary. On the second afternoon, he appeared at the fence line with 2 cups of coffee and held one over the top without a word. Isadora took it. They stood on opposite sides of the fence and drank in silence, she was beginning to understand the language Sheridan Driscoll used when he had decided something without quite being ready to say it out loud. 3 nights passed without incident. Isadora slept on a camping mat on the back porch with her grandfather's old shotgun propped against the wall. It had not been loaded in 20 years, and she had no ammunition for it, but the sound it made when you worked the action was something no one who heard it in the dark was going to evaluate calmly. She drank black coffee from a thermos and watched the camera feed on her phone and listened to the neighborhood settle and reset around her. The distant sound of the interstate, the particular silence of 2 in the morning in a residential street. On the 4th night at 14 minutes past 2, her phone buzzed. She was awake before the second vibration. She pulled up the camera feed. On the rear perimeter view, 2 figures in dark utility clothing were moving along the outside of the fence. One of them carried something large on his back, a pressurized tank with a shoulder harness, the profile unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. She pulled the tarp release. The canvas dropped from the pulley and settled over the Aurelia Black in a single motion, covering the canopy and the upper two-thirds of the vines in the time it took her to get to her feet. She heard the men freeze at the sound. Then the one with the tank began moving faster, and she heard the fence creak as they came over it, and she heard the hiss of the pressurizer being activated. She hit the floodlight switch. The yard went white. At the same moment, from the direction of the side gate, a beam of light cut across the yard from a different angle. Sheridan Driscoll was standing at the gate with a heavy-duty work flashlight pointed directly at the two men, and he had not knocked or called out or asked permission. He had simply come. The men at the plant froze in the combined light for perhaps 2 seconds. Then the one with the tank made a decision and aimed the nozzle at the base of the plant, at the exposed soil around the root zone below the tarp line, and triggered the spray. The chemical foam hit the ground with a sound like something burning and a smell of ammonia and sulfur that reached Isadora across the yard in the same instant that she raised her grandfather's unloaded shotgun and worked the action. The sound it made in the quiet residential night was considerable. Both men ran. They went back over the fence with the urgency of people who have decided very quickly that they do not need to be anywhere near here, and they left the pressurized tank lying in the mud at the base of the trellis, and Isadora heard a van door and an engine, and then nothing. She dropped the shotgun and ran to the plant. The foam was spreading across the exposed soil, bubbling where it contacted the earth, the chemical reaction visible and active. She grabbed the garden hose and tried to dilute it, but the clay absorbed the toxaway compound faster than the water could follow, and she knew from what Absalom had told her that dilution was not going to be sufficient, and she went to her knees in the mud anyway, and kept trying because there was nothing else to do. Sheridan stood 3 feet behind her, holding his flashlight on the affected area. He did not say anything. He was not a man who filled silence with words when silence was the more honest response. After a while, she stopped and sat back on her heels and looked at the damaged soil and the drooping edge of the canvas tarp and the chemical foam working its way outward in the beam of the flashlight. She was covered in mud from the knees down. Her hands were shaking, which she noticed with the detached observation of a person who is holding the rest of herself very still. She said the root zone is compromised. Sheridan said the plant will likely not survive this. She said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry, Isadora." She looked at what she had built in 6 weeks from a piece of dead ground and a single black seed, and she did not say anything else that night. She turned off the floodlight. She sat in the yard until it was almost 4 in the morning, and then she went inside and she left Sheridan standing in the dark with his flashlight, because she needed to be somewhere he could not follow for a little while. When the alarm on her phone went off at 6, she had not slept. She put on her boots without looking at them and walked to the back door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch. She stopped. The Aurelia Black was not dead. It was not merely surviving. It had grown. Overnight, in the hours since the chemical attack, the vines had thickened to a diameter she would not have predicted possible, and the canopy had expanded in every direction, pressing out against the canvas tarp from underneath, so that the whole structure lifted and shifted with the new volume beneath it. The leaves were a vivid, almost violent ultraviolet purple, and the branches she could see along the tarp's edge were bowed down with the weight of new fruit clusters that had not been there at midnight. She stood on the porch and looked at this for a long time. Absalom arrived at 7:15. He pulled his truck into the driveway without being called, which meant he had been awake through the night the same way she had, waiting. He walked around to the backyard and stopped when he saw the plant and let out a sound that was something between a laugh and an exhale, the sound of a man who has spent 11 years waiting to find out if a thing he believed was actually true. He said, "I told you." She said, "Explain it to me, right now." He said the Andean nightshade lineage evolved in high-sulfur volcanic soil. The genetic baseline of this plant treats sulfur compounds as a nutrient signal, not a toxin. When the toxaway hit the root zone, the mycorrhizal network your system established treated the sulfur component as a priority nutrient source and began processing it at the fungal interface. The plant did not just survive the chemical, it metabolized it, converted it. The toxaway became a hyper-accelerated nitrogen input, and the plant responded the only way this variety knows how: explosive growth. He picked up the pressurized tank from where it had been left in the mud. He turned it over and looked at the label. He held it up so she could see it. The label read, "Property of Right Agrotech, Industrial Toxaway Defoliant, for commercial brush management applications only." He said, "We do not simply have a plant that cannot be destroyed. We have a plant that grows stronger when someone tries to destroy it. And we have the equipment that man sent to do the destroying with his company name printed on the side, caught on 3 cameras from 3 angles on the night that it happened. She looked at the tank in his hands. She looked at the plant behind him, twice the size it had been 12 hours ago, pressing outward in every direction with what she could only describe as confidence. Absalom said, "I know someone who has been waiting 4 years for exactly this kind of evidence. Her name is Florentine Hollister. She works for the Seattle Tribune. She has a file on Birch Calloway and Wright Agrotech that she has not been able to publish because until tonight she did not have anything hard enough to anchor it to." Isadora said, "Call her." He already had his phone out. She looked at the Aurelia Black one more time in the early morning light. Then she went inside to make coffee because what was coming next was going to require her to be completely awake. And she understood now with a clarity she had not had at any point in the preceding 2 months that what was coming next was not a defense. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Florentine Hollister sat at Isadora's kitchen table for 1 hour and 53 minutes. She did not accept the coffee Isadora offered. She did not remove her coat. She opened a canvas bag and took out a digital recorder, 2 notebooks and a camera, and she arranged these items on the table with the economy of someone who had done this in a great many kitchens and had learned that the less time spent on setup, the more time remained for what mattered. She said, "Walk me through everything from the board presentation forward. Dates where you have them. Exact language where you remember it. Do not editorialize. Just tell me what happened in the order it happened," Isadora told her. Florentine listened without interrupting, except once to ask for the spelling of a name, and once to ask Isadora to repeat a specific date. She wrote in the second notebook with a mechanical pencil, filling lines in a small, precise hand. When Isadora finished, Florentine closed the notebook and looked at the camera footage on Isadora's phone for the third time, pausing at the moment the toxaway tank became legible on the camera 2 feed. She said, "I need you to understand something about this story before I write it. I have a file on Wright Agrotech that I started building in 2021. What you have given me tonight closes the file, but closing it means opening something else. Your name will be in this story permanently. Whatever Birch Calloway loses when this runs, you gain the same amount of exposure in the same moment. Some of that will be useful to you. Some of it will not be." Isadora said, "I was blacklisted by a man who made calls before he fired me. I have been living on rice and peanut butter in a cold house for 2 months. I think I can manage exposure." Florentine looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone reassessing an estimate upward. She put the recorder and both notebooks back in the canvas bag and stood. She said, "There is one more thing. The internal documents I need to complete the picture are not things you have and are not things Absalom has. I have a source inside Wright Agrotech who has been sitting on materials for 3 years, waiting for a moment like this. I cannot tell you who it is, and I will not be able to tell you afterward either. What I can tell you is that the source contacted me this morning before I came here and is prepared to provide documentation." Isadora said, "How much documentation?" Florentine said, "Enough." She left. Isadora listened to the car back out and then stood at the kitchen window until the taillights were gone, and then she went to the back porch and stood looking at the Aurelia Black in the dark, its canopy faintly visible as a deeper shadow against the night sky, pressing outward in every direction with that quality it had always had of knowing exactly what it was doing and not requiring anyone's permission to do it. The story ran on Sunday morning. Isadora was at the table before 6 with the coffee already made when Absalom sent the link. She read the headline first, then the subheading, then the full text twice without stopping. Florentine had written it the way a good carpenter builds a joint. Nothing decorative, everything load-bearing, each piece fitting the next with a precision that made the whole structure feel inevitable. The sabotage footage was there, described in enough detail that any reader could see it clearly without needing to watch it. The toxaway tank was there, the company label quoted verbatim. The 2015 Seed Preservation Institute defunding was laid out in a timeline alongside the 2018 Wright Agrotech catalog introduction with Absalom, named as a direct witness who could identify the matching specimens. The mycorrhizal loop suppression was documented with internal communications that Isadora did not recognize, dated and sourced. She sat with the article for a while after she finished reading it. The internal documents were the part she kept returning to. She had not provided them. Absalom had not provided them. Whoever had provided them had access to Wright Agrotech's internal systems and had been holding the materials with patience and purpose, waiting for the moment when their value would be maximum. She thought about Odessa Whitfield clicking the portfolio shut. She did not call anyone. She made a second cup of coffee and went out to check the root zone moisture on the Aurelia Black and let the morning do what mornings do. By Sunday afternoon, the article had moved beyond the Seattle Tribune. Two regional agricultural industry publications had linked to it and added context from sources Isidore did not know Florentine had spoken to. By evening, a national outlet had picked it up with additional reporting. Right Agrotech's investor relations line issued a statement that said nothing and confirmed everything people needed to know about how serious the situation was. Monday answered the remaining questions. Right Agrotech opened the trading week down 18%. The number continued moving in the same direction through the first hour of trading, while the board of directors convened an emergency session in a conference room that Birch Calloway was not present in, because by the time the session started, Birch Calloway had already received a call from the board chair that made his presence unnecessary. He was removed from the CEO position before noon, stripped of his severance package under the morality clause in his employment contract, and informed that the company's legal team would be in touch with him in a capacity he had not previously occupied relative to that team. By afternoon, the King County Prosecutor's Office had issued a formal statement confirming an investigation into allegations of deliberate environmental contamination, criminal trespass, and destruction of private property. Absalom followed all of this on his laptop at Isidora's kitchen table, providing periodic updates in the tone of a man who has been watching for a specific outcome for a long time and is now simply confirming what he already understood would happen. Isidore was in and out of the kitchen throughout the morning, listening to his updates, asking a question occasionally, and then returning to the yard or the greenhouse framing that the construction crew had begun installing 3 days earlier. She was not celebrating. She was working, which was her version of the same thing. On Tuesday morning, Leocadia Kenmore called. She was an intellectual property attorney who had contacted Isidore the week prior, and she spoke with the focused efficiency of someone who had reviewed the situation thoroughly and arrived with a plan already formed. She said, "I want to file the patent applications for the Aurelia Black genetics in the mycorrhizal loop system this week. The story has created a documentation window that we should move through immediately while your position is publicly established, and Right Agrotech is in no condition to mount a counterclaim. My fees are deferred to first licensing. I need 2 hours with you today to begin." Isidora said, "I can give you the afternoon." Leocadia arrived at 1, and they worked at the kitchen table until nearly 5, going through the technical specifications and the chain of custody for the genetic material and the development timeline for the mycorrhizal loop, with a thoroughness that left Isidora's hand tired from writing and her mind clarified in the way it gets clarified when something that has been formless becomes formal. When Leocadia left, she said the applications will be filed by Thursday. After that, anyone who wants to use either technology will need to come to you. Isidora said good. She meant it in a way that went past the practical meaning of the word. It was on Wednesday morning, 4 days after the article ran, and 2 days after Birch Calloway's removal had been confirmed in a formal board statement, that she heard a car on the street moving slowly. Not stopping, just slowing as it passed the house the way a car slows when the driver is looking at a specific address. She noted it and went back to what she was doing, which was reviewing the greenhouse installation schedule with the crew foreman. 40 minutes later, the doorbell rang. She opened the front door and Birch Calloway was standing on the step. He had come alone and on foot, his car parked somewhere she could not see, which told her something about how he was currently navigating the question of being recognized. He was wearing the same quality of suit he had always worn, but it was not arranged with the same attention. He looked like a man who had recently lost access to the infrastructure that had been managing the details of his presentation, and who had not yet fully adjusted to managing them himself. He said, "I wanted to speak with you in person." She said nothing. She stood in the doorway and gave him the space to continue, which was a technique she had learned from watching Florentine Hollister work, and which she understood now was one of the most effective things you can do in a conversation when you have more patience than the other person. He said, "I want you to understand that the decisions I made were not personal. This was a business situation, and I managed it according to the requirements of the business. I believe you are capable of understanding the difference between that and something personal." She let him finish entirely before she spoke. She said, "You called 3 industry contacts before my termination meeting. You knew my mother had died 8 weeks earlier and that I had spent my savings on her medical care. You chose that specific window to move. I want you to hear me say clearly that I know you did that, and that I know you knew exactly what you were doing when you did it. That is not a business decision. That is a decision about a person. Those are not the same category of thing. He did not have a response to that. She watched him search for one in the way she had watched him search for nothing before because Birch Calloway had always had a response ready, and the fact that he did not have one now said more than any response would have. She stepped back from the doorway so he could see past her into the house and through the back windows to the yard where the greenhouse frame stood in the November light, with the Aurelia black visible behind the new polycarbonate panels, its canopy pressing against the interior frame in every direction, dense and alive and permanent. She said, "You sent people here to kill that plant. It grew larger. You suppressed my research for 3 years. I built a company from it. You offered me $50,000 to disappear. I declined. I think we have covered everything there is to cover between us. You can go." He stood on the step for another moment. The thing that crossed his face was not dramatic and was not simple. It was the expression of a man encountering a fact about himself that his previous arrangements had successfully kept at a distance, and finding that the distance was no longer available. He turned and walked back down the front path. He did not look back. Isadora closed the door. She stood in the front hallway and breathed. The tight thing that had lived behind her sternum since the morning she walked out of Wright Agritech with a cardboard box had been diminishing in stages over the past weeks, and now in the quiet of the hallway with the door closed and the street silent on the other side of it, she noticed that it was simply gone. Not gradually gone. Gone the way a weight goes when you finally set it down after carrying it long enough that you stop noticing you were carrying it. She went to the kitchen and called Absalom. He said, "How did it go?" She said, "He came to tell me it was not personal." Absalom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I imagine that went well for him." She said, "I sent him away." Absalom said, "Good. Now come and look at the south wall of the greenhouse. The crew put the ventilation header in the wrong position, and I have been waiting for you to authorize moving it before I say anything to the foreman." She laughed, which was not something she had done often in the past several months, and which felt in this particular moment like something returning to its correct position. The venture capital meeting was on a Thursday in the third week of October. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a building 2 blocks east of where Wright Agritech's headquarters had been before the board voted to relocate during the post-Callaway reorganization. Isadora noticed the geography as she rode the elevator up the way the city arranges and rearranges itself around the movements of people and institutions. Old addresses becoming new context without the buildings themselves changing at all. Grant Ellery was the lead partner, 58 years old, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that the most useful thing you can do in a negotiation is make the other person feel that time is not a factor. The two partners flanking him were younger and less practiced at the stillness. Isadora noted all three of them, the way she had learned to note things that mattered carefully without letting the observation show. Ellery said, "Your revenue figures are strong for the timeline, but the real value proposition here is not the fruit. It is the underlying system. The mycorrhizal loop technology deployed at scale can rehabilitate degraded and chemically compromised agricultural land. In the context of current global soil loss rates, that application has a market that extends significantly beyond specialty produce into industrial land remediation and commodity crop production." Isadora said, "I know. That is why the licensing structure for the loop system is a separate revenue line from the Aurelia Black Seed genetics. They are not the same asset. I am offering a 20% equity stake in Aurelia Botanicals for a capital injection of $2.5 million. That funds scaled seed production, greenhouse expansion to the adjacent property, and the first phase of loop system licensing to partner growers. The valuation is not negotiable." The partner on Ellery's left placed a document on the table without speaking. Isadora looked at it. A 51% acquisition structure with a chief botanical advisor designation and a gross revenue royalty. She had been expecting something like it. The specific form was different from Birch Calloway's offer, but the underlying architecture was identical. You do the work, we make the decisions, here is a royalty, so you cannot say you received nothing. She looked at it for the time required to be certain she understood every element. Then she looked at Grant Ellery directly. She said, "I want to tell you something about where I was 4 months ago. I had $12 in my bank account. I had 61 days before the bank took the only property I had left. Every professional door in my industry had been closed against me by a man who made calls before he fired me. I planted one seed in dead ground with no money and no equipment and no guarantee of anything. What is sitting 2 blocks from this building right now, inside a greenhouse on a piece of land in Issaquah, is what I built from that. I am not telling you this to make a point about difficulty. I am telling you because I think you should understand that I have already operated in conditions that were designed to make what I was doing impossible, and it did not stop. 20%, 2.5 million. That is the offer. She said it the way she said everything that mattered without raising her voice, without moving in her chair, without looking away. 40 seconds passed. She counted them without appearing to count them. Ellery looked at the partner on his left, then at the partner on his right. Something moved between the three of them that did not require language. Then Ellery looked back at Isadora. He said, "We will have the term sheet to you by tomorrow morning." The wire transfer cleared on a Friday. Isadora was checking the humidity sensors in the greenhouse when her phone showed the notification, and she looked at the number on the screen for a moment and then put the phone back in her pocket and finished adjusting the sensor calibration because the sensors needed to be accurate before the next growth cycle, and a large number arriving in a bank account did not change what the sensors needed. She drove to the King County Assessor's office that afternoon. She paid the full remaining balance on the property taxes and mortgage arrears in a single transaction. The clerk stamped the certification form in two places and slid it across the counter and said the house was clear. Isadora took the form and stood at the counter for a moment, not moving. The house at Sycamore Creek Road had been Mehetable Linwood's before it was Isadora Linwood's. Mehetable had tended its quarter-acre for decades, had learned its soil and its light and its seasonal behavior, the way you learn the character of a person you live alongside over many years. She had signed a covenant with the county in 1987 that tied the land to a principal rather than a price. And she had folded the documentation of that covenant and placed it in the bottom of a chest. And she had not explained it to anyone because Mehetable Linwood was not a woman who felt the need to explain the things she believed to be self-evident. Isadora had found the covenant document 2 weeks earlier while searching the blanket chest for property records. The language was straightforward: a permanent conservation restriction prohibiting sale or transfer to any industrial agricultural entity, binding on all subsequent owners, recorded with the county, and enforceable in perpetuity. Mehetable had signed it because she believed the land belonged to what grew on it. She had not known that 37 years later, a man named Birch Calloway would file a cease and desist in King County Superior Court and attempt to leverage Isadora's financial desperation into a transfer of rights. She had not known because she could not have known. But the covenant was there regardless of legal wall around the property that no amount of corporate litigation could have breached, recorded, and waiting in a county office for the precise situation it had been designed to prevent. Birch Calloway, with his team of attorneys and his years of industry relationships, had never been able to take the one thing he actually wanted. Not because Isadora had stopped him, though she had, but because Mehetable Linwood had stopped him in 1987 without knowing his name. Isadora folded the paid-in-full certification and placed it in her coat pocket alongside Mehetable's silver locket, which she had not sold and did not intend to sell, and which she now understood she had never seriously considered selling, regardless of what the bank account said. She drove home. That evening, Absalom arrived first, coming through the side gate with his clipboard and his unlit pipe moving at the deliberate pace the cooling weather encouraged. Sheridan came through the same gate 2 minutes later, carrying 2 mugs, and handing one over the threshold to Absalom without breaking stride, which indicated a level of coordination that suggested they had walked over together from Sheridan's side of the property, something Isadora noted without commenting on. The three of them stood in the greenhouse in the early dark. The LED array was on, filling the space with a warm spectrum light that caught the Aurelia black fruit clusters and made the dark crimson and gold of the skin glow with the same quality Isadora had first noticed on a Tuesday evening at her kitchen table, the quality that had made her set down her knife and simply look. Absalom said, "I spoke with a researcher at the University of Oregon this week. She is working on a soil remediation project in the Willamette Valley agricultural land that has been chemically degraded over 30 years of conventional farming. She wants to run a pilot program using the mycorrhizal loop system on 12 acres starting in the spring. She is the third inquiry I have received in the past 10 days." Sheridan said, "How many acres can you support in the first year?" Isadora said, "With the northeast field coming online in March and the licensing structure Leocadia has built, we can support 3 pilot programs simultaneously without compromising the primary seed production operation. By the second year, if the pilots perform, we can begin certifying independent growers to deploy the system under license." Sheridan looked at the north wall of the greenhouse for a moment.